Okay.
I believe we lost Marley in that instance.
Marley, did we lose you? Well, that's not good.
Maybe she just froze up. We'll see. She's gonna come. She's gonna log
She'll be
back.
coming back.
Yeah, it should go off.
Hey,
and
a
come
little
back.
technical difficulties, you know.
Okay, for everybody who's waiting and wondering what we're doing, this is the first time we've done this, so we're having a little technical difficulties. We're broadcasting live on Facebook, and we're also recording this session so that it'll be available later on the web. Well, she lost her power. Okay, so while we're waiting for Marley to come back, let me introduce myself and then, oh, she's coming.
Hi, I apologize. The power went out in our neighborhood, and so excuse the delay.
Okay, I was just telling everyone that we're broadcasting on Facebook and we're recording, so you can take it from there.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
I said you can take it from there.
Okay, thank you. 1 moment. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Marley Ynigues. I'm the Social Justice Local League of Women Voters, Morgantown-Monongalia County. Thank you for joining our inaugural Social Justice Forum. Tonight, we're bringing together community leaders to discuss how we can support our neighbors now and in future winters, even as we anticipate another winter storm this weekend. Throughout the season, I've had the joy to volunteer as a grassroots advocate for neighbors who are unsheltered, cooking meals for unsheltered folks, driving folks to the warming shelter, volunteering overnight, and sharing emergency planning ideas from other West Virginia communities. The League of Women Voters is committed to social justice, and in November petitioned Morgantown City Council to open a second warming shelter downtown for all warming shelters to be seasonal. We're pleased that the county's one warming shelter has since committed to being seasonal, open all winter, rather than closing when over 40 degrees. We hope to continue constructive community dialogue like this through our social justice forums. Tonight's discussion will center around winter resources such as shelter and heating, and how to make these services more accessible, more effective, and with dignity for all our unsheltered and undersheltered neighbors. Thank you. Judy, I'd like to introduce the League of Women Voters of Morgantown-Monongalia County's Vice President, Judy Ball, who will be co-hosting our event tonight.
Good evening. Glad to see you all. I hope I don't lose my power in the midst of this. I should tell you that I was born and raised in West Virginia, but I left, as so many people do, after graduating from WVU. And during my 20 plus years with the federal government, I really wasn't a community activist. There was no time. That all happened after I retired, and that was in Corvallis, Oregon in 2008. And there, one of the things I spent a lot of time on was as a vocal advocate for people who were houseless. With the League of Women Voters, with the Corvallis School Board, and also with a nonprofit named Corvallis Housing First. In fact, some of my best memories and most profound experiences are from my time volunteering at Corvallis's men's cold weather shelter. At first, I was scared because, you know, you hear stories. Oh, the stories. But you know, none of those stories turned out to be true. And it was a wonderful experience for me and the services that we provided. Now, our shelter was far from perfect. It was only open for limited months. This will be familiar. We were open from November through March and with limited hours. Check-in in the evening was between 7 and 8 p.m. and check-out in the morning was 7 a.m., which is pretty early when nothing else is open. The building we had at the time I volunteered there was, shall we call it, spare. It didn't even have a shower. But it was a low barrier shelter, which meant there were rules, but all of the rules could fit on a single sheet of paper. And the only reason we had for excluding someone was bad behavior. And that low barrier nature was the shelter's greatest asset. So here I am again, hoping that my experience in Corvallis can be beneficial in our efforts here in Morgantown. And I hope Morgantown can do better than Oregon in providing services for our most vulnerable in the city and county. Thank you.
And we would love to start introducing our speakers. Brian Butcher, if you get us started alphabetically. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, my name is Brian Butcher, Morgantown City Councilor for the 7th Ward of Morgantown, West Virginia. This is my first term on City Council. I've worked with various social service agencies in my time with the city, but I guess one of my more relevant experiences with relation to this issue was that I was houseless for a period of about a year, if you can call it like that, permanent unhoused. I was what a lot of the system would like to describe as a transient houseless person. I wasn't stably unhoused for a long period of time, but other than about a year. And maybe a little less than that, but within Huntington, West Virginia. And I was fortunate enough at that time to have a car to sleep in. You know, but for many in our community and across the world, lots of individuals, both housed and unhoused, need support throughout cold winters. Losing heating in the home that you live in, and if you're low income, can be a death sentence for some people, especially for elderly individuals. So when we talk about warming shelters, we're talking about people that were unhoused like me, but also people that are generally having difficulty within their community and making sure that they are safe throughout the winter months, which can be incredibly cold and can cause various health issues for people by being exposed to that cold for a long period of time. You know, warming shelters, in my view, are stopgaps that are meant to be extremely low barrier ways of providing emergency services. I think that's an important sticking point, is that this should be viewed as an emergency service that people have access to because they are in an emergency situation. And we should treat it as we do someone going to the ER, right? Being exposed to the cold, you know, I think that we as a community need a walkable and accessible low barrier shelters throughout the winter, you know, and during warmer months, we need to be able to provide varied and sustainable alternatives to people within our community whose needs can be incredibly complex, and the way that we solve these issues can be incredibly complex. And wraparound services for our unsheltered population should always be the goal that we're striving for. And I think that we should always be looking at ways that we can improve until we completely eradicate the issue of houselessness, which probably will not happen within any of our lifetimes. We should be always striving for better. And so that's what I'm here to discuss today with participants here. And I really thank you for allowing me to come here and speak tonight.
Thank you so much, Councilor Butcher. And Laura Jones, could you please continue? Thank you.
Sure. I am the executive director at Milan Puskar Health Right. I have worked in healthcare in various settings for almost 40 years in West Virginia. And I have learned a lot in that period of time. Health Right is, for those of you who may not know, a free and charitable clinic. And our primary goal is to provide healthcare to people who are uninsured, underinsured, and now we have added Medicaid folks to that list as well. And we have a very small number of people on Medicare. We believe that healthcare is, we take a very broad view of healthcare. So we look at housing as an issue. It's a health related issue, emotional and mental health. All of the aspects of life are related to healthcare in some way. And so we have always had a close relationship with the folks that are either living at a shelter or are houseless in our community. And it has been, well, let me just say that I will speak as someone who has worked in an agency that provides services to folks. I cannot speak for people who are currently houseless, but I can tell you what I've heard and what experiences people have shared with us about what their needs are in our community. And I appreciate being here tonight and looking forward to hearing everyone.
Thank you so much. Pastor Morton, thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Reverend Zack Morton. I serve First Presbyterian Church, which is a downtown church right here on Spruce Street and Forest Avenue. We're kind of right in the thick of it downtown. I'm a graduate of West Virginia Wesleyan from undergrad, and I am an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA. And as being a downtown church, our location, our geography is really important to us. And so by default of proximity, we find ourselves in a position where we, our fundamental commandment is, a church is to care for our neighbors, right? And a lot of our neighbors down here are folks who are in different modes of crisis, and a lot of them are houseless. So we do our best to be good neighbors and provide, again, like low barriers and direct service, and partner with everyone else down here who's doing the same sort of work and has the same ends of serving those folks. And so we're in a unique situation, I think, as a church, because we choose to involve ourselves a lot with it. So we kind of get to see a little bit more directly what's happening down here and be in relationship with those folks. Our church has been doing a pancake breakfast that is a free breakfast on Sunday mornings from 8 to 9. We've been doing that for over 25 years now. Never missed a Sunday. So that has been kind of the foundation of helping get our church kind of a longstanding tradition of being involved with folks. I personally do some counseling with folks who just drop in. We provide emergency food cards. We provide transportation, both bus transportation and gas cards for folks who have need of that. We've done a ton of just like folks pop in and we respond and help where we can, when we can. We've been involved with helping people get hotel rooms through a little kind of cooperation that we have from groups here, which I'm sure you'll hear a little bit more about later. We provide a warm space on Sunday mornings. That was prior to COVID, and we're looking to start that up again. But we leave our church open on Sunday mornings for folks to come and go, because there's no public place for people to kind of hang out, because most of the public buildings that they have a chance to do that are closed on Sunday mornings. So we try and provide a space for that as well. And we frequently partner with, again, other folks who are doing the work. We've provided a bunch of tents through Friendship House. We try and make sure anyone that comes to us that says they need that form of, crisis basic shelter, that they have that they have tents, that they have sleeping bags, that they have pillows and things like that. I mean, we've gone so far as to help people like fill up propane tanks for the little propane heaters for those of some of them have those in their tents. So it's like a little bit of everything that we kind of do and are involved with. And that's only, part of what we do at the church. So I'm grateful for everyone who's in that kind of direct service work full time, because we kind of get to see that. But I think, one of the best things, and I'm sure Laura will vouch for it too, is we get the ability to kind of be in a relationship with folks and build relationships over time with them and get to know people down here and hear some stories, which is just vital to how you formulate an approach to doing this kind of work and the kind of good policies that we want to see, just coming from a place where we're hearing and interacting with folks from a place of like shared humanity, shared stories, shared mutual respect and dignity is so important to how we approach any decisions that we make when working with folks who are living in crisis and who are houseless. I'm also involved in the city's committee for houselessness and our work group for public education. So wear a couple hats.
Well, wonderful. We've got some amazing speakers here with us tonight. I'd like to take a moment to start us off on one of the things you mentioned, the sleeping bags, propane, things of that nature. We're expecting a large snowstorm this weekend, and it's really great to see the community come together, grassroots individuals as well as local service organizations, faith-based organizations, to help provide some of these supplies to folks who are unsheltered. Would any of y'all like to speak to that and how cold weather supplies can fill in a gap in services in our community?
Sure.
I can
I'd be
speak.
hap-
Oh, go ahead, Laura. No.
Well, I was just going to speak from today. I happened to be in the parking lot when the Friendship House staff brought back an entire Subaru station wagon full of hygiene supplies, backpacks, socks, gloves, hats, blankets, pillows, and most of the folks have already received tents. So we feel like we've gotten quite a bit. We had a huge box of coats. And typically, I think on Facebook today, I saw at least 4 different groups that were asking for support for the weekend for folks because of the storm that's coming. And that is an amazing way to do things. I think what would be equally amazing would be for us to have a low barrier alternate space for the folks that are going to end up being in tents over the weekend. And I think people are often maybe confused with language. So sometimes we talk about overflow shelter, and that means that the shelter is full and then we need space for the folks that can't get into the shelter. But what we're really talking about is an alternate shelter for folks who have difficulty in the shelter structure. And those folks are always out there. There are always people that have difficulty with the rules or with the structure of the shelter. And so we really do need a low barrier space. And we've had them successfully. Health Right and the Spruce Street Methodist Church work together to create that 1 year. And there were issues, there are always issues that we had to deal with, but for the most part, we kept at least 15 people every night warm and safe during some really bad weather. So it's great to be able to get the things that people need to stay safe, but it would be even better if we had an alternate space for people who don't feel comfortable going to the shelter situation.
Yeah, I think Laura did a great job kind of describing the situation that we're faced with, and I would reiterate the fact that it's heartwarming and it's amazing the level of support that people can get throughout our community. That level of support should not be required, in my opinion. We should have a structure upon which we could get people in housing during the winter, even just a temporary shelter. We've done a lot this winter I've worked with many volunteers to make people receive winter supplies that they need. That includes things like propane tanks. We've gotten people, sleeping bags, and all of that can be very ad hoc. It can be very stressful and difficult for volunteers who do not do this as their main job. As you may have noticed, Laura indicated that they are a healthcare agency. And the most basic form that we could make sure that people's health is taken care of would be to make sure that they are out of the cold. I think is quite a very easy and basic need that we could have people meet, and they are having to fill in these gaps because the current structures that we have in place in our community do not serve those needs. It is, I think there are a lot of different barriers that people come up against when they try to find shelter during this time of year. So, that could be their current portable shelter being thrown away, torn down. It could be their things getting stolen by other individuals. It could be any number of things. But one thing that I think that we should make as a priority and make sure that we have as a basic understanding of how we provide social services, especially during the winter, is that for people that need to access an emergency service that will mean their life, limb, or death if they don't access it, that we should be able to provide that to them, notwithstanding their inebriation status or any status that they might have had with the shelter in the past, or their gender or their how fluid their gender might be, the fact that they have pets, the fact that they have things that they need to store. These are all barriers that we've come up against, and the reasons why we need to provide those cold weather materials to people, right? Because they come up against barriers to our shelters within our community, and then therefore they need something to make sure that they are shielded from the elements in some capacity. So the outpouring of love and charity that we see throughout our community and aid that we see throughout our community is a way to try to put a very temporary, very flimsy Band-Aid on what is a system that is not serving the people that it purports to do so. So I think that should be centered and understood. And as we talk about, and I don't think the intention or the reasons matter quite as much as making sure that this just happens, right? That we just make sure people get warm. I don't really care, what kind of politics might be there, what kind of reasons might be there for not allowing X, Y, or Z person there. All I care is that they have a safe place and a warm place to rest their head. And I think that it should be the center of the conversation. And I think a lot of that's been lost within our community during the discussions that we've had about, like you said, Laura, about what overflow means, or what how this should be structured, or when it should be staffed, or how many people should staff. Like the county put up $40,000. Well, the county and the city put up $40,000, and with the expectation, at least my expectation, that we would have a low barrier shelter. And to the people on the street and to the many volunteers that I've interacted with, that has not currently happened. I don't really care why it didn't happen. I mean, I do to an extent, but all I care is that it does happen. You know what I mean? And that's what I'll say on that for right now.
Thank you. Another quick comment on this. Ms. Joan, you mentioned a low barrier shelter and your experience through Health Right and helping out with additional warming shelters in past winters. What policies do you think are very important to make such a facility safe and accessible?
Well, first of all, in the conversation, it triggered a thought to me that people are not aware that we have community members in our community who have lost fingers and toes because of lack of warmth. And in my time at Health Right, I do not remember anyone actually freezing to death. But people have lost fingers and toes, and we have managed wounds from people being cold on numerous occasions. So it is a real health concern. And I'm not sure people necessarily know that you can actually get hypothermia when it's 40 or 50 degrees, especially if you get wet from rain or sweat or any other wind. So it really is a big issue and a big health concern. So we operate a mental health drop-in center, and in that process, we have learned a lot of things. And one of the things we've learned is that having a multitude of rules and regulations has the opposite effect. What really works is spending time and getting to know people and listening to their stories. And I just did a presentation the other day on stigma and drug use. And one of the things that happens when all of us have some level of stigma about people who are houseless, because we grew up in a society that perpetuates that stigma. And stigma is a dehumanization. So we all talk about the homeless. That group doesn't exist. There are unique individuals that ended up houseless in unique situations. And so you can't lump everyone into one category. And so one of the things you have to do is learn how to rehumanize people. And that's through listening and letting yourself listen openly without judgment. And that's when you start to remove your stigma. And so that is the key to how our staff operate, how we help and keep people hopeful despite some really frustrating and difficult situations. And it also involves having some education about mental illness in particular. A number of people that are houseless suffer from different kinds of mental illness. So that training is absolutely essential. One of the things we also know is that through the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, is that many people who are houseless have trauma and have experienced trauma. And there are certain things that you don't do when people have trauma. And it's best to treat everyone as if they have somehow been traumatized, because you don't know, and you may not hear the full story. And that includes, there are a lot of things that you have to do differently. You have to make sure that people have a way out of the situation they're in. You have to be very respectful. You never touch people without asking them first. There's just a long list of things that are really important. And so that kind of training and that kind of mindset it can be an agency mindset. The whole agency and all the people you hire have to have that knowledge and mindset in order to work with very vulnerable people.
Thank you. And to your point about humanization and learning more about people as individuals, I'd like to bring it back to Reverend Morton. First Presbyterian has recently been surveying our community and trying to make sure that people's voices are heard and needs are heard. If you could share a little bit about what you've learned through that process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said earlier, I mean, we're just kind of in a place where we hear lots of stories from folks and how they are doing and how they got in the places and the situations that they're in, and they're all unique and different. So, see that just fundamental reality is something that we have to realize whenever we're crafting any sort of solutions or services to help people, and that they have to be incredibly flexible to meet people in whatever situation that they are in, because so often we want to kind of over systematize whatever we're providing, and that always draws a boundary and a barrier that is at some point becomes inflexible, depending on how it interpret, but it becomes inflexible and it ends up being a barrier to people. And the more we try and certainly to some extent we need rules and regulations, and some organizations need to operate that way, and that's perfectly fine. But we have to recognize that there is a whole demographic, a whole group of folks who are in crisis, who are in trauma, who are suffering from all these different things, plus the fact that the situation that they're in, being houseless, is trauma. Like, they are in a crisis situation. And so that puts you in a different frame of mind, and the ways that you act and respond are going to be are going to take compassion and grace to deal with those situations. And so just understanding that very fundamental thing. I mean, when I think of translating it to a human language, like that language of low barrier, in my mind just means approaching these situations with compassion and with grace. That's what low barrier should mean in terms of our human expression, that is how we approach the situation, and that we're willing to create systems that serve people in situations that have a certain amount of flexibility, and that listen to people who they are meant and designed to serve. That's a big thing too. We have to listen. We have to hear their kind of stories. So we have to, like Laura keeps saying, the theme that I keep here is that there's a lot of relationship, a lot of back and forth, and that is just indispensable whenever it comes to doing this kind of work. Is we need that relational back and forth between folks who are trying to serve and the folks who are in crisis. We have to have that. We've recently I recently put together, and this is pretty recent, because we have a lot of folks who come here again on Sunday mornings and just drop in and visit with me for different things during the week. We created a survey to kind of get the lay of the land and get some information and data points on folks who are kind of, this is a group of people who are generally more or less falling through the cracks, or for whatever reason can't access or won't access the services that are available. And like, there's been some really interesting pieces that that I hope will help shed some light and help us learn. So like, for example, one of the questions we asked was like, how long have you been living in Morgantown? And over half of the responses out of 30 responses are there folks that have been here for over 5 years in Morgantown. And I think, you know, that stigma, a lot of the refrain that we hear sometimes is that like, oh, these are just people who are passing through, who are just here for a certain time to take advantage of services, and then they move on. That was less than 4 people who responded have been here less than a year. So almost everybody has been here for a year or more, and most of them more than 5 years. And I think that's really important when we approach this, because these are residents, citizens, neighbors. They belong in our community. A lot of them have grown up in Morgantown or grown up in Preston County. They're not that far down the road. So these are our own, and we have, to a certain extent, like, we have a moral obligation to recognize that and do what we can to pull our resources and take care of each other. That's just the human, compassionate thing to do. And before I preach a sermon, I'll take it back a little bit. But but yeah, so we really hope that you know, kind of collecting some data from this group of folks who kind of fall through the cracks a lot, so that we have some real information to work with, to hear from them, to help our city officials and folks who are helping us design policy, that we can, you know, listen and learn and design some solutions that do a better job of meeting those diverse needs.
That's really interesting to learn. Thank you for sharing that with us. Councillor Butcher, you were recently an advocate of the right to food, which the City Council passed as an ordinance saying that residents have a right to food. And that's supported by a lot of different measures, such as making it easier for folks to start community gardens, things along those lines, more access to food pantries. It seems like the city could consider other ways of supporting folks who are not only unsheltered, but also undersheltered in the community. Reading up on this, I saw a statistic, a quote from 2021. The National Energy Assistance Directors Association wrote that if it was a normal year, meaning not during the pandemic, when the CDC had put forth certain additional regulations, but in a regular year, 40 states would have implemented some sort of utility shutoff moratoriums during the winter months to protect customers from losing home heating when the temperature drops. West Virginia doesn't have any sort of law like this, but some cities do. It can be done on the city level as well. Do you think that there's a possibility for local government to support unsheltered folks in ways that aren't that are additionally to funding? We have a lot of people in the community whose homes have lost heat this year. It's been a very cold winter. So I just want to see your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, thousands of ways that we could work to address inequities that we see within the housing system, right? You know, I think that moratoriums, like you were saying, on heating disconnects and things of that nature, I mean, I think that's a pretty basic thing that could probably be achieved at relatively low cost. One of the things that I had spoke about when we had talked about, you know, like for our utility board, and that I was joined with several members of council on, was like, you know, increasing the late fees on people. I think that when our utilities and companies in general like to punish people with late fees. They're really not doing themselves a service, and definitely not the people that they're serving. Most people who are going to pay you a late fee couldn't pay their bill in the first place, obviously. So why do you think charging them more money means you're going to get your money? It doesn't really make any sense. It's just a way to punish poor people. But yeah, I mean, I think that the city has done a pretty good job with its ARPA planning in terms of looking at ways that it can address houselessness in a more in a way of providing more housing stock, right? But I think one of the big issues that we face within our city in terms of just rapid rehousing is an availability of those places. You can ask anybody at the coalition and they will tell you. And we've experienced it recently as a group of volunteers with someone we were trying to get housed. Luckily we did, though. But like, you know, that's a very stressful situation that people have to be in. Not just the people who are working with the individuals, but obviously the individuals themselves. And so, you know, I think that Morgantown has a really large problem with both rent and housing price availability right now that will cause further pressure on the systems that we're discussing tonight. The individual that I'm talking about, like, was housed before, and I mean, he just lost his money. I mean, like, these aren't like when I was unhoused, it wasn't like I grew up, you know, my parents are fairly wealthy. It's not like I grew up, you know, in a destitute situation. It's just that most people who are even middle class in this country are 1 or 2 paychecks away from being unhoused. And so, you know, that's an ever-present fear that people have, and anything that we can do to relieve that pressure is something we should do. One of those ways is, again, trying to find ways that we can provide affordable housing. Housing currently sits on you know, a market and is traded like anything else, right? It's traded just like you would, you know, an iPhone or anything like that. It's got a price and it's traded like a commodity. And for rich people, that's great, because then they can invest in homes and they can make money off of them. For us, everybody else who uses the shelter as a place to survive, it makes it incredibly difficult for us to then therefore provide for our families and our neighbors. So, you know, I think that looking at reducing the number of just vacant households that we have in the city that are kind of have absent landlords that just sit on these houses while we have, you know, probably about 25 people sitting out on the street unhoused, and then get code enforced on whenever they go into these empty houses is criminal. I mean, it's not something that we should be accepting as a norm as a society at large. And unfortunately, that's just kind of how our structures are from the bottom up, right? Which in some cases entails that we need to go higher than what we are on the city level in order to change some things. Like, in order for us to receive HUD funding, there are some things that we can't violate. But, you know, like you said, Marley, I do think that there are, you know, several different ways that we can look to just be more welcoming to houseless people, to making sure that we regulate places that provide housing, or, you know, provide the structures so that they are the kind of places that we want our unsheltered population to be engaging with and interacting with. I think there's conversations that can just be had politically and just as face-to-face as like individuals talking to one another, and making sure that we have an understanding of what our shared goals are, both as a city, you know, with government and service providers with a company, that like we have shared goals and we have shared values. We have an understanding of how we both want to serve our populations. I think that like that dialogue is incredibly important. And, you know, it's unfortunate that often that dialogue does not get we're not able to have it. So you know, like there is a lot of funding that we need to dedicate to it. But you can't just throw money at it, kind of as you were suggesting, Marley. Is that there is a changing of culture, attitude, and understanding of what the situation actually entails that needs to happen between our service providers in our city, our government, our administration, our citizens, and our business owners. Literally everybody that you can think of, really. And just so that everybody that interacts within the city that cares about us as a community, I don't care if you like only care about the fact that we you know, have the most tax base that we possibly could for businesses. If that's all you care about, then you should still care about the unsheltered population. Like, this should still be a huge priority for you. You should have an understanding that, like, the more people that we can help and thrive within our city so that they are like you know, having a good time and having a good life, then like everyone is happy, everyone is better, we all make more money, we all are able to invest in our community, and not just in like our business owners and our developers, but people from all income classes. And that I think you know, is the point I try to make often, but is often overlooked by people who are just trying to make policy that they think will just kind of erase the problem. So
thank you. I think that's really helpful to see that there are ways that the city, the county, the state, whoever can shape policy through their priorities, even if it's even when it's not necessarily funding a particular program. But on the flip side, what one piece of funding from Arpa do you think will make the biggest difference in keeping Morgantowners warm and sheltered next winter?
what piece of funding? Is that what she asked? I'm sorry.
Yes, and just very briefly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the piece that we're providing to the demolishing of old homes will be the biggest one that we've already allocated. I do believe that we need community engagement on our second round of funding to try to figure out maybe a community, like a community space that we can all have that we can kind of use for that purpose. That's what I think we should try to do with the next one.
Thank you very much.
Marley, can I jump in?
Yes, please do.
It brings me to a point, and Zach may have discovered some of this in the surveys and the discussions with folks, but one of the things that has been traditionally a difficult issue in our community is that we have had people who are housed and then unhoused and then housed and then unhoused. And what we lack, and I don't know that this is, I mean, there's no blame here because it would require funding. But what we lack is any kind of support for people who are newly housed. I think we underestimate how difficult it is to live unhoused and then suddenly be housed. And everybody makes a rookie mistake early on, and they get an apartment and they're thrilled they have an apartment and they want to take care of all their friends. So they invite all their friends to come over when it's cold and stay with them. And this starts a trajectory that could end up with an eviction. And we don't do a good job of preparing people for expectations and then following up with them to make sure that they have the new barriers that are now going to be they're going to be facing are taken care of, or they are assisted with those new barriers. And that could change the situation in terms of how many people we have unhoused at any given time, if we could do a better job of supporting them once they're housed.
Yeah, Laura, one interesting thing that I found in the survey. One of the questions was, do you stay alone, or do you stay with a small group, or do you stay with a large group of people? And only a small minority said that they stay alone. Most stay with a small group. You know, most folks who are experiencing houselessness have a crew that they figure things out with, right? And stay together in a tent or a situation where they put them together or whatever they have to do. You gotta, when you're in that kind of situation, you gotta work together. And so when one out of a crew of 4 people who have been attached at the hip for the last 6 or 7 months surviving gets a place, of course they're gonna want to extend that benefit to the people they run around with. That's just like, if you were in that situation, you would probably respond in the same way, right? So again, like, it's that human element that isn't accounted for, and I think that's something to think about in our considerations around this kind of stuff.
Yeah, we often put people into apartments with almost no furniture. They have no radio, they have no television. And so it's quiet and it's lonely, and they're not used to that. So there's a lot that we could be doing that could help support people in their housing. But we have to use the knowledge that we have, that we get from the people, like Zack was saying, that we get from the people who are in this situation, not what we think they need, but what they say they need.
So when you're talking about some of these additional wraparound services, I think that's really key to the idea of housing first. When someone is housed, they still need support in other ways. But it's housing first, not housing only. But it's also recognizing that the most important first step is to make sure everyone has a safe roof over their heads and such.
Right. Marla, let me jump in here.
Okay. Go
My
ahead.
experience with Housing First in Oregon was that people who were houseless, who were ready to be housed at their option, we couldn't just put them into an apartment and leave them. That was not the model. The model was, here's your apartment, here's your place. But then it was permanent supported housing. So we had case managers that interacted with folks to make sure that they got signed up for benefits that they were eligible for, to help them navigate all the various social services and healthcare services that they may needed to have access to. And that support, I mean, it's probably a bad analogy, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's sort of like growing a child, that you don't expect a toddler to be able to do adult things right away. They need support to move through developmental stages. And I remember meeting this man in Corvallis who, he had been in Corvallis Housing First, an apartment in our apartment building for quite some time, but he came there from living on the street for a long time. He had been chronically homeless. And I remember having a conversation with him, and he was delighted that he had this place of his own, but he had been on the street so long, he couldn't sleep in a bed. It was so foreign to him. So Laura, the kinds of description you make of apartments that don't have any furniture, don't have a radio, don't have a TV, this is not the way we would expect you and me and our neighbors to live. We have to think in terms of making places livable, and that first and foremost, that people deserve these things. And we need to help them take advantage of them, make the best out of them. And the whole purpose of housing first is you start with a roof over somebody's head, and they can grow from there with support. But you can't just expect them to do it on their own. You're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. You're absolutely right. We had several years ago, many years ago, actually, we had a client that we got an apartment for, and for weeks he slept in the hallway of the apartment building in front of his door. And so the problem we have is that we do have some permanent supportive housing in our community, maybe not enough. And then we have other programs that don't come with that full wraparound support. And case managers often have caseloads that are way too high to provide the kind of support that people need, because it's labor intensive. It requires really getting to know people and developing trust with them. And it's just, you can't have 30, 40 cases or people that you're trying to support with case management. It has to be smaller numbers and more intense services. So yeah, I hear what you're saying.
Thank you, everybody. I'd like to bring in a few questions from our Facebook live chat and Zoom chat.
I have a couple from the Zoom.
Great.
Let's start here, and I think Pastor Morton, this may be especially directed at you and maybe Councilor Butcher. The questioner says, I remember a discussion a few years ago about the fact that it's almost impossible to count the homeless outside the Morgantown area because we don't know how to find those folks. I would add to that, it's probably almost impossible to count them inside Morgantown.
That's what I was going to say.
Does anyone know if any thought is being given to trying to figure out how to address this problem of how big is the scope of the problem we're trying to solve?
You want to go first, Brian? Or?
I can.
Go for it.
I would encourage, I mean, anybody within the sound of our voices here to join the PIT count, the point in time count, when it occurs every year. And that's when we try to do this very thing, right? Where we try to figure out how many people are here. To be 100% honest, I believe that this nationally and probably worldwide is an issue that we do not prioritize for a lot of the reasons that we've spoke about on this call so far, is that we've dehumanized the people who are houseless. So it is not a priority to figure out how many people are houseless. If you've ever done a PIT count, it's not necessarily the most formal, most like scientific way of making sure that we know the population of our houseless within the city or in any location. I mean, this is a national way that HUD uses in order to verify the population of the unhoused. You know, do we know if any thought is being given to try to figure out how to address that problem? I mean, I think that there are probably thousands and thousands of community activists across the, even just the state of West Virginia, that would love to figure out better ways in which we perform these counts. There's also not all that much priority placed on it, or, you know, it's not, in a lot of ways, there's no one that making sure an accurate count occurs serves within our system, right? So if you can't find somebody who is receiving benefit by receiving an accurate count, it's a little hard to push for it. You know, that's why we as activists need to participate in these counts to make sure that people who are not normally who are normally invisible throughout these processes are taken notice of. And it's also important that we as activists like bring that issue up uh, and try to advocate for it. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, long story short, I was part of the point in time count this past year here at Morgantown, and it's it's absolutely a joke to think that we could have any sense of how many folks are experiencing homelessness in its many different forms and different levels of housing insecurity within a 24-hour period in one of the coldest months of the year, because it happens in January every year, right? So folks are resourceful. Like we said, when people double up and triple up and find places to stay, like that can happen on those coldest nights. So like, for instance, this year, it was a particularly cold night when we were supposed to do that count. So it made it way more difficult to find people. And, you know, a lot of us kind of knew a certain amount of people and knew where different people were staying and had a different idea because had relationships with them. But it is a farce to think that we're anywhere close to what the actual count is. So I mean, that's just one little piece of the puzzle here. A good gauge, I think, to even begin to start to measure what the actual issue is and how widespread it is to look at the statistics for the school district, because under McKinney-Vento, school districts are required to do their best to identify students that qualify with a definition of what houseless and homeless is. And that number, I guarantee you, is much higher than you think it is for Monongalia County. And that, I think, gives us a baseline. When you look at how many students are experiencing houselessness and qualifying under McKinney-Vento, and then you compare that to like the number of kids in the school district, you start to get a ratio, and then you can start to like guess at a baseline number, right? Like, and begin to accurately guess. But it is impossible to do at any one point in time. But I think that's probably the closest we can get. At some point, I think what Brian and Laura have also kind of alluded to as well, when we're having any of this conversation, we have to think 1, 2, 3 levels higher at the same time that we're thinking about like a baseline crisis level of service. I think the best metaphor to think about is think of folks who are experiencing extreme poverty and houselessness. Think of them as like they're in a river, they're caught in a river, they're being swept downstream. You may have heard a similar metaphor before. What we're talking about with these warming shelter direct services, we're fishing people out of the river as much as we can, trying to see them, drag them out, right? But at some point, we have to go upstream and say like, okay, how are people being dragged, pushed into the river in the first place? Like what is causing that? And we have to be thinking about that at the same time. And we need more people and more citizens to begin thinking in that way, in that bigger way, because really, I mean, the baseline of it is that we've, I'll get a little bit crazy here, but like we've been kind of trained, propagandized really is probably the right word, to think about the world through a lens where we think of like, okay, what is development? What is our community? Oh, it's like getting the next big box store or seeing how many like high-end apartments we can develop that are for upper middle income people. But we can own, that is not responsible development for a community that is as mixed as Morgantown, right? And really every community is, but especially here in Appalachia and in Morgantown, right? We have people from all sorts of cross sections socioeconomically, and that's a good thing, you know? Like we need to lean into that. That's not a bad thing. I want a diverse group of people, but I want everyone to be taken care of, right? And have the basics that they need. That should be the baseline for a community. So like when we think about like, okay, how do we want to develop, you know, areas around downtown in different areas, like we need you know, political leaders, and we need people, everyday citizens, to say like, well, how many, if we've built 300 upper middle income units of housing, how many have we built that are for like lower income or middle income? Or how many units have we built that have been dedicated to folks who could qualify like for a HUD housing that the coalition could use, right? Like we need that kind of housing more than we need middle to upper level income housing. We need that kind of responsible, inclusive development as part of our city plan and how we expand and move into the future together. If we don't start thinking from that perspective of how do we go upstream and create the kinds of places, the kind of communities where everyone can live and live a better quality of life, then we're not going to solve the problem. We're just going to keep fishing people out of the river, so to speak. And I think we need more thinking like that all across the board from all of us in our community. I think that's kind of all of our responsibility to think more creatively about that.
Let me add something to what's already been said. It's interesting. I used to do data for a living, so this is stuff that's near and dear to my heart. Back in Corvallis, I was at a city council meeting one night, and they were having a work session to talk about houseless people in Corvallis. They were spending the entire evening talking about it. And at one point, city councilor said, "How many people are we talking about?" And everybody sort of looked at everybody else, and the city manager looked at everybody else, and nobody knew. They had no idea. And so the League of Women Voters, the Housing Committee, the League of Women Voters said, we ought to do something about this. I wonder what we could do. And I already knew that the point in time count that had been done, at 1 year, there was this massive change in the count. And we talked to the folks who were responsible, and they said, oh yeah, we had money that year for an intern. We had people to manage the count so that it was organized, it was managed. We got a better count, or at least we got a bigger count. So what we did was the league, we started with the point in time count, but then we went to a variety of social service agencies that served people who were houseless around the community and asked for data. And we pulled it all together. The school district was included, the local sheltering agencies, a whole bunch of different, every social service agency we could think of. And we tried to put it together in a way that would reduce the amount of duplication, because nobody collects it with identifiers, so you can actually deduplicate. Long story short, what we found was it was like looking at an iceberg. And the point in time count was the very tippy top of the iceberg. And nobody had ever looked at all of the iceberg that was submerged. And frankly, they didn't want to look at it. But it was valuable. We wrote up a report and we published it, and we handed it out all over the city, and did a presentation for the community. And after I left, the League of Women Voters did an update. And Corvallis isn't very different in many ways than Morgantown. It's a college town with a big land grant university. Corvallis is thought to be affluent, but in fact, of all the cities in Oregon at the time I was there, it had the highest income disparity of all the cities. And so we had a population of people who were unsheltered that was really, really important. And people thought that they were from out of town, and the data showed they weren't. And I mean, we learned a lot from doing this report, things that were sort of common sense, but people didn't know. So one suggestion is it's possible to do that. And we did it with volunteer labor. It didn't take hiring somebody and paying them. Another way to get at this, and this comes from a question that we got, is somebody is curious about how the usage of the emergency shelter at Hazel'S house compares to the usage when the shelters were downtown. Are the numbers the same? Are they bigger? Are they lower? What do we know?
So I don't know exact numbers, but I can tell you that historically the shelter downtown was bigger. At one point, they could handle many, many more people than they're handling now. But because they moved to our community moved to a housing first model, the idea was that people would only be in shelter for a short period of time, and then we would get them housed. So I think they can only hold about 23 or
28.
28
in the standard rooms.
Yeah. Okay. And I don't know that they have been full every night, but that's kind of seasonal too. When the weather is better, sometimes they aren't full, and when the weather is cold, then they are full. But that doesn't get at the number of people who are actually not going to the shelter at all, who choose not to go for whatever reason. When we had COVID in 2020, and it wasn't as bad as it was going to get, but everyone wanted to get folks who were houseless off the street so that they could actually sort of shelter in place. And we worked with the agencies, the shelter and the coalition, to get people into hotel rooms. And we put the word out, and we expected that we would have about 17 people based on what we knew from the drop-in center. And when the word got out, we ended up with 50 people who were not using the shelter and were unhoused, many of whom we did not know. So we were doing like brand new intakes with people. So I think that the number is much higher than even a point in time count can get at.
Thank you. And a quick comment about the drop-in facility, Friendship House. I think it's really important to have facilities like that, because it's clear from the resources you're providing to the community, people are being treated with dignity. There have opportunities to use resources, like I know there's a computer lab, things of that nature. It's really great to have that available in the community. To some of these comments about Bartlett House and the warming shelter, just a little bit to make things clearer for some of our viewers who might not be as familiar. Bartlett House is, in addition to providing transitional and longer term housing outside of its shelter, it is the shelter for folks who are unhoused in our community, and it is the location of the warming shelter. So which is basically, it's a bit overlapping. If you haven't been using the Houseless shelter, or the triage shelter as it's called, you can still come in and use it as a warming shelter. But that does present some difficulties there, especially, including space issues, as Ms. Jones was mentioning, because, there are 28 regular rooms, there are a few other, or 28 regular spaces to sleep in 4 rooms. There are, it's not really a space where a lot of folks feel they're able to go if there's just for under shelter needs, if their home loses heating. Just if we're near the capacity of that, just with folks who are unsheltered, that could be that could be an issue of access as well. And along those lines, we mentioned, we have some questions in the comments about expanding housing options or alternative shelters. We have a question for Counselor Butcher. Well, okay, sorry, it says this is for Counselor Butcher, but I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on this proposal. I've read a lot about tiny house villages and how some municipalities have used them to provide a small community for houseless people to live together. Sounds like a fantastic idea and would address a lot of problems we have in addressing this issue in our community. Would a tiny house village ever be feasible in Morgan? And if not, why not?
It does sound like a fantastic idea. I think it is also an idea that unfortunately is still rather stigmatizing. So, you know, people who are houseless, I was one, I'm living in a house that I own now. And I think all of them deserve housing just like everybody else. I think it's a great measure for as a stopgap, which is most of what we've discussed tonight, as a stopgap between getting people into, you know, from living literally on the street, sleeping on the sidewalk, to having permanent housing that they can live in. I have seen where some cities, I believe it was San Francisco or Portland, cannot remember, have taken where encampments have been set up and they just simply put a tiny house community in that same space. I think that's a pretty good solution. You know, again, as a stopgap, you cannot make that be the, like, okay, we've taken care of the problem now. You know what I mean? Because it's not. Some people would choose to live in a tiny home, and that's fine. Like, I don't have any, but if someone's like shelter needs are not being met, then we need to figure out a way to shelter them in a place that provides them with dignity. And you know, cordoning people off into another separate community, I mean, you're just ghettoizing, right? So I implore people to keep that in mind when they think about tiny house communities, because it's often spoken about as a kind of a method in which to solve this issue, and it is not. It is simply another stopgap, albeit a good one. I think it is a good one. I don't want to take away, you know, too much from it, but just I feel like a lot of times people's expectations need to be tempered on those grounds. Now, as far as implementation of something like that, like I had said before, I think a good idea is, like, especially in public spaces where people have already established encampments and we know that it's safe, you know, depending on where it is, but I think often people find like good places where they can congregate and they feel comfortable in. And as long as it's a space that we can make work, I think it's not a bad idea to try to set up a tiny house community there. Again, with implementation, therefore you need a contractor that is working in good faith, a contractor that and a group that is trying to make sure that this community is supported, as we had talked about, after these kind of places get established. You don't just build the house and walk away. You know, it's the kind of place that we need, that would require constant social services, right? So you're talking about like build up and expense there, but then you're also talking about a large expense of making sure that it's maintained. It's something that's worth spending money on. Don't get me wrong at all. I'm just, again, trying to temper people's expectations on what these require. They require a sustained effort and an understanding that it is not the end, both inside of the community itself and then where we get people once they, and the goal should be to get people out of that community and into, if they choose to, into, you know, more permanent housing and something that's like, again, not specifically kind of cordon off community just for people who were recently houseless.
Quick logistical. No, we are running a little bit close to the top of the hour. We've still got a few questions. Would y'all be able to stay just a couple more minutes if we're Running toward the edge. Okay, and thank you. Okay, another question. The city is currently updating its comprehensive plan. Maybe we need a comprehensive plan to address our houselessness situation, i.e. go beyond addressing affordable housing, as Zach mentioned, and lay out concrete initiatives, including addressing upstream challenges and make sure houseless people have a voice in the plan. That is a great idea. Any thoughts on that, Counselor?
I think that's 100% something that should be a top priority of things like our houselessness committee. I think there's a few things that we should center as far as comprehensive plans. If you were attending a comprehensive plan, the comprehensive plan meeting or any of them, one of the criticisms I had been public about, and this is not our city, this is how comprehensive plans are handled within government, is that they center around what development and success means. As Zach had kind of mentioned earlier, is that we should set different priorities for what development and success means, or we should understand that there is large differences in goals and that we can work towards all of them. And that we should, like I've talked about, having racial equity comprehensive plans. I think a housing one is absolutely needed as well. Those are two issues that I think we can work to address, and that we should be. I think it's a great idea.
Thank you. I gotta go upstream to make waves. I'll quickly address a question about the template in general. Somebody asked about some other speakers that we had on the list tonight. We did reach out to the Bartlett House and they were going to speak with us, but were unable to attend. Stephen Prince, pastor of several churches here, including Sabra United Methodist Church, which had run warming shelters this past winter on some of the coldest nights, was also unable to attend. So I'm really excited that we were able to speak to some of the experiences with our other speakers, including Ms. Jones downtown, and Judy, you have a comment?
Actually, there's a comment in the chat that I wanted to share before we leave, from Christopher Schultz. He says the CARES funded Mountaineer Rental Assistance Program has started to pivot from rental assistance toward an initiative to help the unhoused secure housing. The proposal is to provide a future lease certification and first month's rent. Does anyone on the panel have experience with this? If not, does this sound sufficient to help the local community?
I can tell you, and maybe I'm wrong, Brian, but I think that the CARES money for rental assistance means that you have to be houseless due to something that's COVID related. And we've run into that before, and maybe I'm wrong, Brian, that might be a different pot of money.
One moment, I have a 3-year-old running through the room. There he goes. All right. You know how it goes. So
everybody's welcome here.
Ask the question one more time, because I had a 3-year-old bucking me. Sorry, Laura.
Oh, no, that's okay. So the initial money that came out, and I know West Virginia has done a really awful job of spending the money they had. But the initial money that came out required that your houselessness had to be in some way related to the COVID situation. Now, maybe they've changed that because but it's difficult to argue that if you've been unhoused for 5 years, that your current housing problem is because of COVID.
Yeah. And a large portion, as you had mentioned, I don't have the number straight off my head, but of the state received funding for that specific purpose. went unused and had to be returned. Speaking with FMHA, for Fairmont Morgantown Housing Authority, about this specific issue a few times, so it is a great way to get people housed that are not in need of a ton of other supports. So people like myself, for instance, when I was unhoused, I could probably just use like a first month's rent and a security deposit, and I would have been at least on my way, right? I would also need a job, but like, you know, I would have been okay because I knew like how to live on my own. I had a car, you know, I had, you know, friends that would help me, and I could crash on their couch if I needed to, stuff like that. And it has helped a lot of people. I know a lot of people that it's helped. When FMHA received a lot of all their vouchers for the CARES Act money, they actually sat on them for a good little while, not like, you know, held them back from people. They just didn't have anybody to give them to until they like kind of publicized them, and then they were all gone very quickly. And you know, so there is a need for it, and it is helpful for a lot of people. Laura, I do think that there are some stranger requirements that come into the CARES Act funding. I couldn't tell you exactly what those were. I did have a friend that applied and got denied. But I think the issue that she had was she was about to be evicted. So she couldn't get the funding because she hadn't been evicted yet. As in, her landlord hadn't served her an eviction notice because they were like trying to see if they could get the CARES Act funding. And then they go to serve her an eviction notice so that they could get the CARES Act funding, and the funding wasn't there. Like, it's this is the kind of stuff that we don't need in the way, and that's kind of creating issues because people want to means test this stuff. This is an issue we have with housing in general, and like supports in general, is like people want to means test all this stuff instead of just, you know, taxing wealthy people. But you know, it's you know, we shouldn't be means testing basic things like human necessities like healthcare and housing and stuff like that, where like people deserve it. But yeah, I do think it's not sufficient. I wouldn't describe it as that, but it is a great support that we could use.
Okay, one other question. Would it be possible to offer houseless folks a place to simply and safely store their possessions? And I'd also like, that's a question we got in the chat. I'd also like to follow it up with, do you see any other simple things that might need to be addressed? I've heard bike racks a lot in the past. Any other things that y'all see, especially working downtown or?
Yes. So there are plans at Hazel'S House of Hope, the new Ramada Inn complex, or the old Ramada Inn complex, and to have lockers available for people and showers, as well as laundry facilities. And there is a plan to include a community day room that would allow people to hang out up there, do their laundry, take showers, store their things up there. And this is a really, I think, a key issue. I don't know that it needs to be up at Scott Avenue, but the Friendship House is actually a mental health substance abuse recovery center. And we've gotten very much away from that focus because we have been filling in as a day shelter for the community. And so we'd like for there to be an alternative for people to be able to go to a community day shelter where they can sleep and get, you know, other basic services, so that Friendship House can get back to its original roots, helping people move toward recovery. And so that all of those things are in the works, and hopefully will create more options for people, which I think is always good.
We have another question concerning Hazel's house. This is from a participant who says, as someone who goes up onto Scott Avenue every day, is there a plan to improve pedestrian access to Hazel's? And I want to add, I was driving out to Walmart the other day from downtown to get my dog's prescription. And I saw this giant sign for Scott Avenue. Before that, I had no idea where Scott Avenue was. And I couldn't believe how far it was from downtown. And we were expecting people to somehow get there. Now I know there are buses, there are volunteers, but still, we're expecting people to get there. So is there a plan to help people access the services that we have segregated out of town?
Oh, can I jump in on this? So when I did a like a fundraising and education campaign a few years ago called Walk for West Virginia. And I literally walked from Morgantown to Charleston and recorded little videos and stuff along the way. A lot of the stuff's still up, so if anyone's interested, just look up Walk for WV. Put that in your Google search, you'll find the website. And there's also a Facebook page for it. But I literally walked that route before that stuff was up there. So I've literally walked from downtown that same route that people take, and it's a terrible route to walk. It's awful. And there is no back way up there, like you can't take the rail trail and then come up. And I live down that way. I live south on Grafton Road, and I have picked people up and see people walking that route all the time. And there is the road, the 4-lane that people drive 50, 60 miles an hour on, a berm that's about a foot wide, and a guardrail, and then a drop off. Someone's going to get hit. That's my fear. And I can't believe someone hasn't already. But that's been a real oversight, in my personal opinion. And on that survey that I did, one of the last question that we asked was, since some downtown services have been moved out to the Scott Avenue location, have you found it easier or more difficult to access services? And you can probably guess what the responses were. But 1 is the easiest, 5 is that it made it more difficult. 0 responses were a 1, right? There was 1 response that was a 2. There were 2 responses that were a 3. 8 responses that were a 4, and 19 responses that were a 5. So no matter, I think that's been a real difficult logistical challenge, and has been a real oversight in terms of the reality. Like we dream up these ideas and solutions, but then the reality of them is so different, and we don't often think through that enough. And it has made it more difficult for folks and put them in a dangerous situation walking up and back from there, because not everyone is aware of bus transportation service. It's not always reliable. I know a lot of people have put a lot of work into getting the transportation situation squared away, but nothing changes the difficulty of a physical change of location, of having services 3.5 miles apart. Again, I know, I walked it.
One last.
I totally agree with you. And, Health Right is going to be moving up to Scott Avenue. Friendship House is not moving to Scott Avenue. It will remain downtown, but not in the middle of downtown. So it'll still be walkable. But just know that Health Right made the decision to move up there only with the commitment that we're going to have a bus running at least 40 hours a week, maybe more, to make sure that people can get up there and get back from there without needing a bus pass or anything else. So we've already got the van. We just need a driver. We can take 15 people at a time. We're going to make it happen.
Yeah, we had organized a group of us. We're doing just ride sharing that we would show up outside of Health Right to make sure that people got transportation to and from that couldn't access or didn't know about the bus for whatever reason. So, yeah, I mean, that's always going to be a logistical challenge.
We're getting a little close on time. Let me add one last quick comment about the transit. Speaking as a member of the Mountain Line Transit Authority, there are some plans in the works to make Route 50 the Don Knauts route to Scott Avenue and Hazel'S House of Hope and several other service providers up there. A fare-free route, which means you don't need a pass, you don't need anything to ride it. But there's no funding for this yet, and we've been looking at adding an additional bus shelter downtown, but you can't really install it in the winter because of the cold and the concrete and all that. I think a lot of what's happening, I think we've got opportunities for a lot of positive momentum, but we need to realize that even though the winter's wrapping up, we've got to be looking long term, because it's going to be cold here again, and it'll probably be cold here again after March. You know, we tend to have cold snaps. So thank you to everybody who joined us tonight and worked on creative solutions, sharing your experiences, and how we can make things more accessible, more effective, and with more dignity for everyone in our community.
Nice. Can I add one thing before we close?
Please do, and
Will you
all of you feel free to
give me
add any
a
closing
little
remarks you
grace?
like. Thank you.
I think one upstream thing that we need to do and think about, and something that I think we can begin to have an impact with collectively, is realizing that the amount of resources that are available to organizations who are doing this work right now is so inadequate. It's so inadequate. And when you look at like the most recent legislative session, like when do issues of houselessness and extreme poverty come up? When you're trying to like restrict or ban people, right? It's not like, how do we identify this very fundamental problem that more and more people are experiencing and find solutions. One of the things that we need to do is reprioritize these kind of groups. And make sure that folks who are doing direct service work, that the West Virginia Coalition, that they have better resources, more staff, because that's part of the fundamental problem of why these things are getting worse. And that's a part of a bigger political conversation and philosophy that we have to be willing to have, because then how it works out is not only do organizations find it really difficult, but then they don't have the money to pay people who are doing this work a living wage to do it, because they're so underfunded. And what we're saying then is that like we don't value people who do this work collectively as a society. We have to together like do much better on resourcing and equipping these organizations to do successful work, because the people who are doing direct service, like a vast majority of them, are doing insanely difficult work and working in incredible hours. And we have to do a lot better by folks who are doing that kind of work, and encourage more people to be in it, because that is what we need.
I guess I'll give a closing remark so we can have the wonderful Laura Jones close this out as she would deserve. So just to reiterate a lot of what Zach has said, is that I believe that the fundamental way in which we decide how funding is spent and those resources are provided is broken in this nation, but in our state as well. Our state doesn't make it any better. Like you said, we don't have things on the docket to try to make Health Right solvent. We have stuff on the docket to make sure we can't have houseless services in certain parts of the city. So I think that the way that we incentivize our services in order to receive funding necessarily makes the services behave in a way that is not logical and is not helpful for people who are receiving the services. They have to, comport to modes of conducting their business in such a way as to appear successful to our federal organizations and therefore receive funding. I think that's one of the major problems that we have when we're talking about how we provide funding to unsheltered people and the services that they receive. And the final thing I just wanted to leave tonight with is just that I find it profoundly disappointing that when we have this conversation tonight, that we couldn't have somebody that we had invited from our one emergency shelter in town to come and help try to brainstorm on these ideas. And I think we want to try to build a culture in which we understand that we want collaboration. We want to have understanding of how these programs work. And it's very unfortunate that we couldn't have that tonight, and quite sad, to be honest. Hopefully we can continue a dialogue in the future, and that we can, come to mutual understanding. I think all of us here tonight and many, a large portion of the community wishes for our services to be the best that they could be. And so that's what our goal is here tonight. And I think that's what everyone's goal within our community is. And I hope we can have that as a priority going forward.
I would just like to say that our community is incredible at charity. And that is helpful. And I don't want to say but I'm going to say but. But what we need is advocacy for living wages, housing for everyone, healthcare for everyone. We would like Health Right to have to go out of business. That would be a dream. And we'll find other things to do, I'm sure. It won't end all of our problems, but that's what we need: advocacy. We need people who can help get the voices of people who are unhoused or people who are using drugs central in the conversation. We do a great job of right now sitting here talking about people who are houseless, but we don't have direct conversations with those folks when we're creating the policies and programs that we're developing. And I, Health Right, it struggles with that just as much as anyone else does. So I'm not saying that we have the brilliant answer to how to do that, but that's the direction that we all need to be focused on, is ending the reason for the problems that we have, rather than just providing charity. And it's a hard, charity's relatively easy. You can buy a blanket and give it to someone, but actually talking to someone about why they're homeless and helping them find housing is the issue, is the real thing that we need done. So I guess that's what I would leave us with, is that, we're all struggling to do this job, but we need the advocacy of the rest of the community to change policy at the state level, at the federal level, in order to really make all of this work in the long run. And also thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you. We're so glad to have all of y'all with us tonight. And Judy, did you want to say anything?
I'm very happy we did this, and I'm glad that you all came and were so forthcoming and frank about your experiences and your ideas. We appreciate it. And this is the beginning of the conversation. It isn't the end. And I want you to know that we'll probably be calling on you again. So thank you a lot.
Thank y'all. Thanks
Thank you for
everyone who
having us.
participated in the community too.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Have a
Marla and
good
Judy
night.
for organizing.